Welcome to the Holy Post. If Jesus is the reason for the season, why do most Christians celebrate Christmas at home with their families rather than at church? David Taylor, a professor of culture and theology at Fuller, joins me to discuss the origins of Christmas in America. He says that Queen Victoria, Charles Dickens, and Coca-Cola have done more to influence how we celebrate the birth of Jesus than the writers of the Gospels. And he explains why the Puritans who first settled in America believed Christmas was satanic. Speaking of Satan, we have an update on the Satanic Temple display in the Iowa State Capitol. The Texas Supreme Court has made a controversial and very confusing ruling about abortion. And what happens when Americans say they're more religious, but they're less likely to engage in actual religious practices like attending church? And for our HOLYPOST Plus subscribers this week, we have a brand new holiday edition of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess. This time, it's about St. Nicholas and the origins of Santa Claus. And just a heads up, it's way darker than you would imagine. To all of our HOLYPOST Plus subscribers, thank you so much for your support this past year, and we're really excited to share with you all the new things we have planned for 2024. And if you're not yet a subscriber, now is a great time to sign up so you don't miss any of the new shows, bonus interviews, merch, live streams, and HOLYPOST book club selections in the new year. Go to holypost.com to learn more. Here is episode 596. Hey everyone, it's Skye. Welcome back to the Holy Post. I am joined by Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Skye.
Your background has changed for those of you on video, and you got to see this. You don't have your normal bookshelves.
Nope.
That looks like a craft table with lots of scissors. And is that ribbon?
Yes. Today is so weird. We don't have Phil. And also, I am in a craft room. I'm in my mom's craft room at my parents' house. I did another call.
Go ahead.
I did another call earlier, and I was like trying to be a serious intellectual person talking about Christian nationalism, and I'm worried that I'm leaning into some gender stereotypes with my with my background being crafting supplies.
Okay, before we get more into your mom's crafting room for a second, we are without Phil. We are Phil-less, so I am filling in. That works, right?
Oh gosh.
Phil texted us or slacked us yesterday evening, and he's been really, really sick and like wiped out. And I feel bad for him because it's everywhere. I don't know if everyone around you is sick, but it feels like people are dropping all over. My wife was sick all last week. John was sick recently. His office is right next to mine. I'm surrounded by sick people. But I have not gotten it, but it took Phil out.
Yeah. So stay strong, Skye.
I hope he feels better before Christmas. Yeah. That's for sure. So we are flying without Phil, but you are in California at your parents' house in your mom's craft room. I'm just curious, what are her craft, specialties? Because that's a lot of ribbon.
She makes everything. She makes so many things.
Oh.
She was a scrapbooker. She sews everything. She can tailor stuff. She can make beautiful signs. She can wrap things. She's a very handy woman.
And did she pass any of these skills along to you?
Absolutely not. No. I had to wrap Christmas presents yesterday and failed. Yeah, no. I don't have any of that. I have creativity in writing, but not making things with my hands. That is not, no.
Well, that's funny because that is Phil's specialty. He makes things with his hands all the time.
He would love my mom.
And I was working yesterday on my daughter's high school child development final project. So I was cutting construction paper, which was loads of fun. Yeah, things you do. Anyway, with that, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin.
This episode is being sponsored in part by World Relief, the humanitarian organization we trust to tackle the challenges at the southern border and around the world. Last month, we talked a lot about immigration and our recent trip to the U.S. southern border with World Relief, where we learned about how they're serving refugees and other immigrants together with volunteers, local churches, and other partners. I hope you were both challenged and encouraged by what you heard. And for those of you with kids in your lives, I hope you are able to bring them along in understanding how we can love and serve our refugee neighbors with the compassion of Jesus. For a limited time, World Relief is providing a Welcome Refugees family guide that can help you dive into deeper discussions on the topic of immigration and refugees with your whole family. Download your guide today at worldrelief.org/holypost. And as you learn how you and your whole family can walk alongside refugee and immigrant neighbors, I encourage you to consider partnering with World Relief through their monthly giving community. You've heard us talk about it before. It's called The Path. Visit worldrelief.org/holypost to learn more. That's worldrelief.org/holypost. And thanks to World Relief for sponsoring this episode. All right, Caitlin. So the first things first, we need to talk about what we've been up to, because last week you were here in Wheaton.
Yeah.
And we had a good time together. So tell everybody, what did we do?
I mean, we did a lot of things, but the main big thing was we had a live recording of the show, which was very exciting. A bunch of really wonderful people came. We got to meet a bunch of really wonderful people. Esau Macaulay was on the show live in front of people. And yeah, you did something kind of special. I don't know if you want to say it.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Your gift.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's back up first, though, before we get to the gift. Like, to give people some context. So we've been toying around for a long time of doing live recordings or HOLYPOST live events. We've just not had the bandwidth to do that. But with the expansion of our team a little bit, we're like, we should try this because we want to really do more in 2024. So we thought the easiest, lowest hanging possibility is to just do something right here in Wheaton. So we made it available by tickets to HOLYPOST Plus subscribers. And I forget when those tickets went out, but yeah, but they sold out in like 20 minutes. So if you didn't get in quick, you didn't get in. But yeah, we made that available to HOLYPOST Plus subscribers. So like 100 folks came out for this show. We did it at an improv theater, which is a block from our office. Before that, we had a reception here at the HOLYPOST office. Mm-hmm. I always have to pause, otherwise it sounds like Holy Post Office, which is something else. But it was really great meeting everybody. Esau Macaulay, who's a fantastic writer and professor here at Wheaton College, joined us, and we did a live show with the four of us, and that will be made available to everybody, I think, a week from now. The week between Christmas and New Year's. It'll go out as our podcast show next week. But we did stuff like favorite stories from the last year, predictions for 2024, some games and frivolity were had, and then at the end of it, I don't want to. I don't want to.
I feel like you should. I regret bringing it up. It's a good surprise.
There was a gift. There was a gift presented to someone by someone for something, and you all can get that next week when you listen to the live show. So part of the reason I'm sharing this with you all, though, is because we're hoping to do more of these next year. And so two things. Number one, if you are a HOLYPOST Plus subscriber, keep your eyes open for when those events get announced and when the tickets go live so you can grab some. And secondly, if you're not a HOLYPOST Plus subscriber, then you're out of luck. You can't do this stuff and have tons of fun. And from the people I interacted with who came, and some of them came, like they drove. I talked to one family that drove 6 hours from Ohio just to come in that night for the show. And then they were driving straight back, like
crazy
round trip. One person I think who came the furthest was here from Washington State.
Yeah.
Right? I know. Did you interact with anybody that you remember specifically that you want to give a shout out to?
Oh my goodness. There were so many fun people there. And especially, like you said, people who came a far ways because they're just excited about the show. I talked to one lovely woman who works in children's ministry in her church. And I have a special place in my heart for those people. And she was so sweet and just like trying to be faithful in her church. I think it was a good, in general, talking to a bunch of people, for all of us when we spend a lot of time thinking about negative things in the church, to meet a bunch of people who are trying to follow Jesus earnestly, who are trying to be faithful in the communities they're in. And I think what was really cool was I met two people who are librarians who did not come together. They both are librarians. They both love the HOLYPOST. And they just became friends showing up because they were looking for someone else who's like a Christian trying to figure out how to do this well, concerned about certain things in the American church. So that's also sweet too, is that they just found each other.
We have cornered the market on Christian librarians for the HOLYPOST. That could be a whole standalone. But that's a good. I interacted with a few people who also said things like, "I'm trying to find a church in my community that thinks more like folks around the Holy Post think, or I'd love to meet other Holy Post people in my community, but I don't know how to do that. So they came here and kind of connected. But it did make me think, not that we don't have, again, the bandwidth to like launch this now, but
the Holy Post denomination of churches.
yeah, right. No. Talk about
bad
out of the frying
idea.
pan into the fire. Yes, very bad idea. But I do think there's some energy around if you're in a location in a town or city and you don't know other Holy Post people, like there's got to be message boards or someplace you can just go, hey, anybody Holy Post fans want to do a meetup somewhere? I don't know. It seems like it'd be good for people to connect with one another. Maybe we can start like little chapters around the country of Holy Posters. Anyway, it was great meeting everybody. Thank you to all of you who came so far and near to be a part of that evening. We had a ton of fun. A lot of work went into it. Mike, our producer, did a ton, and the interns, the faithful Holy Post interns, did a ton to make that all happen. Grateful for their effort. And like I said, everyone will get to benefit. You're not going to get 100% of the content next week on the show from the live event because it was longer than we could put into the show. And we want to keep some things, incentivize the live event people, reward them for their $20 ticket in the evening of their time. So, but we're going to do more stuff like that in the coming months, not just here in Wheaton, but probably other locations as well. So stay tuned. All right, we got to do a follow-up on a story from last week. We talked about the Satanic Temple putting up that display at the Iowa State Capitol and people losing their minds about it. Well, there's an update. Headline, U.S. man charged over damage to Satanic Temple display. I actually got this article from the BBC because I thought it was one of the better ones out there after reading some of the others. So this comes from the BBC. A political candidate from Mississippi has been arrested after a controversial Satanic Temple display inside the Iowa Capitol was partially destroyed. Michael Cassidy, 35, is a former U.S. Navy pilot who recently lost a race for the Mississippi State Legislature. Mr. Cassidy has been charged with fourth-degree criminal mischief. I love that mischief is actually, in the criminal code.
That's amazing.
Fourth degree. I wonder what first, second, and third degree criminal mischief are.
What other kinds of mischief?
If convicted, he faces a maximum sentence of a year in prison and a $2,500 fine. Okay, so there's more to it. I'll get to that. But he also, so he went on Twitter, this Michael Cassidy character, and this is what he wrote. My deepest hope is that Americans of all political persuasions can unite and agree that... ... Caitlin, any guesses?
No, I don't.
On what he...
I'm already worried. It's going to be bad.
Okay, how about you? Let's do like a Mad Libs. You fill in the blank.
Oh.
Your Caitlin Chess.
Yeah.
Caitlin Chess.
Yep, me.
Your deepest hope is that Americans of all political persuasions can unite and agree that... You fill in what you would say.
Unite and agree against news of the butt.
Oh, come on. That's a cheap shot while Phil's
What would be
here.
great? What would be great is if it was, unite and agree to treat other human beings with dignity and respect and work together to solve our common problems.
I like that.
Thank
I
you.
like that. That's a very good answer. Now, here's what he actually said. My deepest hope is that Americans of all political persuasions can unite and agree that 1, Jesus Christ is Lord, and 2, Satan is evil.
That would be ideal if that happened.
But okay, yes, perhaps, but he says Americans of all political persuasions can unite and agree. Like,
that's not true. Yeah, no.
Right, but he's basically saying I want everyone to believe what I believe.
Be a Christian, yeah.
Right, and yeah, I don't know. It seems like... Okay, so here's my question. What lessons can we take from this entire story? Whether it's the fact that this this display went up in the Iowa State Capitol, and the fact that this guy tore it down and is now being charged with a crime and using explicitly Christian motivations for doing so. Oh, and one last detail of the story I didn't say. He has already put up a GoFundMe page for his legal expenses and has raised more than $40,000 already.
Classic.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, what can we learn?
I have to admit, one of the first things I thought when I heard this was it's a pretty extreme example of what I think happens a lot of the time, where I think we strangely give more power to other things by treating them as threats. So decapitating this thing makes it sound like its physical presence has more power than I think as Christians we should believe that it has. Not that there are not forces of evil in the world. The powers and principalities are real. They also have already been subjected to Christ's rule and reign. We don't see the full consummation of that, but he's out of the grave. Like the death and resurrection of Christ.
They've already been decapitated.
They've already been decapitated. And I think a really important thing about this, this is in both the Old and New Testament, that very often the prophets, the apostles will say it is important for Christians to know that while there is great evil in the world, while we take seriously other kind of powers, we also believe that ultimately they are made by human hands and are powerless. I mean, it was probably a year ago I was preaching on Psalm 82, where it talks about kind of the council of the gods. And part of the meaning of that psalm not only is calling the nations to account, saying actually you are judged by how you treat the foreigner and the orphan and the widow, but it ends with you think you're great gods, you will die like men. Like ultimately in front of Yahweh, they are powerless. And I think that's a really important theological response to this, is to say sometimes actually our response to certain things solidifies them, legitimizes them as threats, when very often the prophets are saying, actually what we should do is ridicule them. Like, this is ridiculous. You put a fake goat head in a fake little statue, and we can laugh at that and just be like, that's ridiculous. You feeling like you need to take it upon yourself to decapitate it makes it appear to other people like you think it has power it doesn't have. And then I was also thinking, just moments before we got on, I was thinking, like, I think we talked last week about, are there times, like, does Paul go around flipping over statues, or does it, like, and the one that came to mind was, at least one time that definitely happens in scripture is when the golden calf in Genesis is destroyed. What I think is so interesting about that is that a lot of biblical scholars think that what's happening in that story is not a rival god in a certain sense. The Israelites just like suddenly 2 days, 3 days, a few days later, just like we have a whole new story. This is their confusion about what God demands of them and their confusion about who God is. That is met with great destruction and judgment, is because they've actually just misunderstood who God is. And I think there's a lesson for us too here of like, you are focused on decapitating this worthless statue made by human hands when we have all sorts of examples in our public political life of Christians worshiping functionally golden calves because we have made God in our own image to sanction our own political projects. That should be met with like the rigor and the judgment of smashing a golden calf, not legitimizing the power of this statue that really can't do anything and doesn't mean anything for us.
Amen. I don't know if you read, Russell Moore has a op-ed article in Christianity Today where he's talking about this story, and he basically makes that same point. Yeah. Like it's not the obvious satanic idol that is the threat. It's the thing that's not so obvious that you are worshiping as an alternative to Jesus, or even calling it Jesus, but it's not, because it represents something. So it reminds me of, I've joked before on the show that apart from scripture, all truth comes from the Godfather movies. And in one of the Godfather movies, he says, you keep your friends close, but keep your enemies even closer. Uh-huh. And it's that idea that you want to know what's going on with your enemies, and you don't want them to perceive you as their enemy or adversary because you're so close to them. And it feels like there are so many enemies so close to the church in America that we don't even recognize them as enemies. Instead, we see the disco-headed goat god Baphomet thing in the Capitol. Go, oh, that's clearly satanic. That's our enemy, and we don't realize how we have gotten corrupted by the idolatry of politics, the idolatry of Donald Trump, the idolatry of Christian nationalism, the idolatry of materialism and greed, the idolatry of ministry success and triumph, like all these things that are warping us. But no, the goat-headed satanic display, that's what we're going to spend our energy going after. So it's just really misplaced. Okay, here's my other take on this. One thing I really like about this story, I know that sounds weird. Yeah. But I feel like it perfectly captures the performative nature of our like culture war politics right now. And I mean that on both sides of it. So we talked last week about Lucian Greaves and the Satanic Temple and what they're really all about. Like their mission, if you read their website or hear his interviews, they don't actually believe in Satan. They don't believe in God. Mm-hmm. They are an atheistic, pro-science, pro-reason, anti-religion kind of organization. And but the question, like, displaying this goat-headed, disco-headed, goat-headed thing in the Iowa State Capitol, did that really persuade anybody that is religious to rethink their religious beliefs? Did it really make anyone go, you know what, science is pretty cool, maybe I should be more committed to science? Did it make anybody who's, questioning faith go, yeah, I'm going to go for reason now instead of myth? All it did was provoke the anger and outrage of Christian conservatives and fundamentalists. So it was really performative. It was not substantive in any way. And then you talk about this Michael Cassidy character. Did him destroying the display really do anything?
Right.
Did it prevent non-Christians from displaying anything in the Iowa State Capitol? No, there's going to be future displays, no doubt about it. Did it unify people around Christ? Of course not. Did it send a message to people that God is real and Satan is defeated? And no, what it did is, remember, this guy's a politician who did this. He's run multiple times for office in Mississippi. What it did is it was a performance that sent a clear signal to his voters in Mississippi that here's a conservative candidate who will literally fight the devil on their behalf. Yeah. And so for both sides, it was just vapor. It was just performative nothing. And yet we get so caught up in this while there are real problems to solve in our country that serious people can't get to work on because we're distracted by this garbage. So anyway, I'm sure we have not heard the last from Lucian Greaves and the Satanic Temple. And on one level, I actually do appreciate these wacky stories because it forces us to wrestle with what does it really mean to live in a pluralistic society and share that with people whose beliefs we don't agree with. Now, I would rather have the discussion with somebody who holds those beliefs sincerely.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Like an actual sincere Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Jew or whatever, rather than somebody who is cosplaying Satanism. But anyway. Okay, so from that lovely topic to an even more difficult topic, we need to talk about abortion again.
I feel like you and I right now are showing what happens when Phil isn't here, which is just like we're serious and we talk about serious stuff.
Okay. And before I even jump into this, I want to just acknowledge a couple of things. Every time we talk about abortion, and it's been a more frequent topic in the last year because of all the news on this, because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade and all the different state laws that have been proposed or whatever. But every time we talk about this, I tend to encounter responses online from two extremes. On one side, I hear from the abortion abolitionists who think that we are squishes, that we're not truly pro-life, that because we don't want to prosecute women who've had abortions, or we don't take some crazy extreme view on it. They think we're squishes. We're and of course the video we put out in 2020 arguing that it shouldn't be the only thing that determines a person's vote for president, all that. Yep. And then we hear from people on the other side who care deeply about protecting women, and they say we're not sensitive enough to women who find themselves in pregnancies that they can't support for a multitude of reasons, and we're not understanding all the complications on that end of it. And obviously, this is not the topic we cover day in and day out, so we're not going to hit every nuance in this. I do want to acknowledge, though, that if you're on the extreme right or extreme left on this topic, you are not going to like what we tend to say on this podcast. I get that.
But you maybe should still listen to it.
Yes, I'm not saying don't listen. I'm just saying we hear you. We get the feedback. I acknowledge your presence in this audience. And you're never probably going to like what we have to say entirely. So with that, I want to talk about what's going on in Texas.
Yeah.
So the Texas Supreme Court last week ruled on a case of Kate Cox. Kate Cox is a 31-year-old married mother of two who's pregnant with her third child. And about halfway through her pregnancy at 20 weeks, she learned that this third child was diagnosed with trisomy. Is that how you say it? Trisomy 18?
Trisomy, yeah.
So a genetic disorder in which the vast majority of children don't survive outside the womb, and if they do, it's very brief. And she's had lots of complications with this pregnancy. She's been to the emergency room numerous times with problems, and her doctor, in her doctor's medical advice, believed that all these things taken together, she's a candidate for ending this pregnancy through abortion. because if she were to carry the pregnancy to term, there's a very strong likelihood that she would be infertile going forward and not able to have more children. And there's some details around that medically that we don't have to get into. But anyway, so it went to the courts, and the Texas law right now says that there's a ban on abortion in Texas, but there's an exception that allows for the life when the mother's life is threatened or when a pregnancy, quote, poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function. So her doctor argued that because she risks infertility after this pregnancy, that would be a major impairment of a bodily function, that she qualified for an abortion, and given the fact that the child was not viable to begin with. The district court ruled in favor of Mrs. Cox, but the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, immediately appealed to the Texas Supreme Court, and he also sent a warning letter to 3 hospitals where she could have had the procedure, warning that they could face penalties if they proceed with going through with the abortion. Big pen. We'll get into that in a minute. And then last week, the Texas Supreme Court finally ruled on this and said, no, they could not give her the procedure. She could not get the abortion. A couple other details going into this. Because her pregnancy, time is important in these kinds of cases.
Yeah.
She decided to leave the state and end the pregnancy legally outside of Texas.
Yep.
But here's where it gets, there's multiple things here that get really, really weird. So first of all, the Texas Supreme Court, the judges on the Texas Supreme Court are all elected, and they're all Republican. Mm-hmm. David French and Sarah Isgur talked about this on their podcast, Advisory Opinions. And when you're a judge and you're running for re-election and you're a Republican conservative judge in Texas, could you imagine if they had voted to allow her to have this procedure, their political opponents would have immediately been cutting ads saying, Judge so-and-so allowed a woman to get an abortion at 20 weeks. Yeah. And it would have been scandalous and outrageous, and they would have lost. So there's definitely a political, electoral factor that went into all of this. So here's what the ruling said, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. They agreed that Mrs. Cox had a very complicated pregnancy and tragic diagnosis. Despite this, the court went on to say, quote, some difficulties in pregnancy, however, even serious ones, do not pose the heightened risk to the mother that the exception encompasses. They also said that the Texas legislature has delegated to the medical rather than the legal profession the decision about when a woman's medical circumstances warrant this exception. So on the one hand, they're saying doctors should make this decision because it's a medical judgment, not a legal one, not the courts. But then the court steps in and says that she was, quote, not sick enough in the eyes of the justices to warrant ending the pregnancy. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the law in Texas, where on the one hand, they're saying, doctors, you make the decision. But then here's a case where the judges go, no, we're going to make the decision, perhaps for political reasons. And last piece, before I kind of open it up for discussion here, the Texas abortion law says that doctors need to make the decision of when a woman's life is at risk or may have permanent impairment of bodily functions to decide when an abortion is necessary. But if the courts decide the doctor's decision was wrong, the doctor faces life in prison, a $100,000 fine, and the loss of their medical license.
Crazy.
So on the one hand, doctors have been given the authority to make the decision. On the other hand, if they make a decision the court disagrees with, they lose their life, their profession, and their freedom. Yeah. So Ken Paxton, by the way, the state attorney general, has repeatedly argued that women with life-threatening pregnancies who do not get appropriate care can and should sue their doctors for malpractice. So these doctors are caught in an impossible situation where they can be sued for malpractice if they don't protect the mother's life. And if they do protect the mother's life and call for an abortion, they can end up life in prison and losing their medical practice because the state elected judges don't want to look weak on abortion.
And suing for malpractice is, pretty small consolation if you do lose your life or serious bodily function because of a doctor's decision about this. Like,
because that can't reverse that with a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Okay, so all that to say, Texas has a lot of ambiguity on their anti-abortion, pro-life statutes. All right, let me just throw it back at you. I normally don't do the work that Phil does of giving all the facts on the case before we jump into the commentary. So I know that was a lot for everybody, and I really recommend reading up on this. We'll link to an article that kind of summarizes it, and you can always listen to Advisory Opinions because they do an excellent job getting into the legal nitty-gritty. But Caitlin, what's your take on the state of these laws like in Texas?
I mean, we talked about this a few weeks ago, but I do think one thing that's just so heartbreaking about this is it does further harm the pro-life movement, I think. Like, people who want reasonable restrictions on abortion access are now either kind of pushed into supporting this. Some of them, I think, are joyfully supporting it, and that's wrong. But even the people who are seeking really reasonable restrictions, this all gets kind of in the water of what they are supposedly in favor of or supposedly celebrating. And I loved in the Advisory Opinions podcast, both, Sarah and David saying, like, I am not for this. I am pro-life, but being pro-life means I am not for this. The other thing I kept thinking when I was reading some stuff about this and listening to that podcast too was this is another instance where we don't have, and this is a good reminder, we do not have good research on women's health. Like, this is true when it comes to pregnancy and childbirth. It is true when it comes to a host of other conditions. Not enough research is done for the conditions that exclusively affect women's bodies. And so both doctors and lawmakers often don't know enough about what's happening in pregnancy and childbirth to adequately care for women. And I also just, like, in general, this is why we need more women's voices in policymaking and in medicine. I mean, I have never been pregnant, but even just being a woman and having most of my close relationships be with women, sometimes I was reading articles about this and I was like, I know more about pregnancy than these lawmakers. Like, it just is something that women share information about, have intimate experience with. We need more women shaping policy in our country for a host of reasons, but especially for something so intimate and important as this. We need women who know the risks associated with pregnancy, not only because they've, researched themselves, they have friends with a variety of experiences, but also because it has a different kind of import to them. Like, this is something they have known in their bodies or a risk they have considered quite personally, so we need more women's voices in medicine and in law. But also, I just think we need to be able to not depoliticize this issue, which is what I hear some people saying, is like, this isn't a political issue. Right. This is an issue for women personally, and this is an issue for doctors. I don't think we need to depoliticize it. These intimate questions of children and medical decisions, like, all of this is political in the sense that we have, it impacts our whole communities. The culture that we have around children, how we think about these big decisions about what actually is a life and what obligations do we have to that life. Those are all big communal decisions we should have publicly. What we do need to do is have this be less of a partisan issue, because, like you said, it just turns into political football of, like, I'm not actually interested in the life of this woman or what happens to her. She, in this case, like you said, wants more children. Like, this is not someone who's uninterested in having children. We're not even interested in the particulars of her case, of the risk that she faces, of other women who hear this and are scared out of their minds, who actually want to get pregnant, but also want to know that they will be cared for if something goes wrong. We're not thinking about any of that. We're just punting back and forth a political football. And that's the part that makes me crazy, is this should be something we talk about publicly. It should be communal decision making. It should be something that we think about on the legal side of things. Like, there are legal things that need to be considered. It shouldn't be, as you described in the Texas case, something where someone's worried about getting primaried, and so they're making a decision that has nothing to do with the particulars of the case.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to me like for decades, the pro-life movement, or I don't know what the right word would be, maybe not the pro-life movement, but pro-life voters have been so conditioned to think of this as a political issue that is solely centered on the Supreme Court and electing the right president to put the right justices, maybe the right senators to pass them through the process. But, like, it's all about getting the right justices on the court, and that's it. Yeah. And okay, you won that battle. Right. You overturned Roe. It needs to rapidly shift from a political question to a persuasion question. Yeah. How do you get more of the American public on board with pro-life legislation? And a story like this is going to do the opposite. It is going to take people who are in the middle, who are persuadable on the pro-life question, and push them squarely into the pro-choice camp. It feels a little bit like that horrible story. I think it was a girl from Ohio or Indiana who got pregnant at a tragically young age through, I think, rape. And like those kinds of stories, which are, I'm not saying they're the norm, but they are horrifically vivid and terrifying stories. And if the pro-life movement is going to make these kinds of cases the hills they die on, you're going to lose the American public. And you're going to set back the cause because you can't deal with the nuances of these cases. The other thing I don't quite understand, I come from a very, very medical family. My father's a physician. My grandfather was a physician. I have an uncle who's a surgeon. My mother was a nurse. My grandmother was a nurse. Like, we have doctors all over the place. And so medicine was always talked about, and weird cases and crazy stuff in our, like, it was, nobody should sit at our dining room table when I was a kid because we talked about gross stuff and no one cared. It was just like normal. Yeah, it was really great. But like just being in that environment throughout my life, you realize, and I was a hospital chaplain at one point when I was in seminary. Like, I was in the room when really rough decisions had to be made at times. And sometimes those decisions have to be made quickly.
Yeah.
And so the thought that cases like this have to go to court and then be appealed and go up the chain for weeks at a time, like, you can't, it just doesn't make sense to me that you would take a life and death decision or a decision that may impact someone's fertility for the rest of their lives and say, well, this is going to take months to go through the courts.
Yeah.
Like, that's insane. You can't do that to somebody. So you have to empower doctors to make, I'm not saying they should, we should go back to a completely no restriction at all kind of abortion regime, but there needs to be reasonably empowered doctors to make life and death decisions. And what scares me about this is it feels like the incentive in Texas is for doctors to put women's lives at risk because they're worried if they make a call and it's second guessed by a politician, they're going to lose their medical license and maybe their freedom. You're too young probably to remember when Obamacare was being hotly debated, like in 06, 07.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, you were the type of kid that would watch
I was a
that on
politically
evening news.
engaged middle schooler.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, do you remember all the talk about death panels?
Yes.
So the argument against government interference in healthcare was that there were going to be these death panels where your critically ill loved one, their care is going to be decided on by bureaucrats and politicians whether or not their life is worth saving because of the medical expense that would go into that. And that rhetoric was used very effectively by the right against socialized medicine and death panels. Well, essentially what Texas has set up here are death panels where non-medical professionals, in this case elected judges, are making life and death decisions for women rather than them and their doctors. So I don't know. I am also pro-life, but what I mean by pro-life is I am for policies, laws, and a culture that reduces the number of abortions. And yet this does not move the ball in that direction at all.
But that really highlights, Skye, like reading some of this stuff about this case, I kept thinking, like, what do we actually want? And I feel this way sometimes with issues on the left too, where I'll see people who, if they get some kind of social capital on Twitter, or they get some kind of boost in their polling, or they get some other kind of reward for doing something that doesn't advance the cause that they are supposedly fighting for. And I just wish that we actually cared, like you said before, about convincing people, about being persuasive, but also we actually do have to ask hard questions about, like, what compromise is too much compromise, and what is actually faithful, what's actually recognizing that you have to give some things to get the bigger things. How do you, like, those much harder procedural questions, strategic questions even, get so easily just kind of thrown under the table, because what we would rather do is make a big kind of public fuss and win some accolades for being radical, table flipping, whatever. And actually, like, the really challenging moral questions, and also a lot of the really powerful work, happens when a bunch of people believe what you just said of, like, I really just want to see abortions decrease. I want us to care about the lives of children and mothers. I want that to be unthinkable in the culture that we live in, but also for there to be reasonable restrictions on it. That's what I want. Okay, then I work backwards from that and go like, what can I sacrifice to get there? And what is not a sacrifice I'm willing to make, a moral sacrifice or a political sacrifice? What would be sacrificing the wrong things? But what would be genuinely good compromise for a pluralistic society with deeply held convictions that differ from one another? But that's not the conversation we have. It's just, let me grandstand, let me win social media followers, let me have a good soundbite.
I think what you're getting at here is something that's been on my mind a bit, and whenever I turn on the news or read about politics. When I hear people from either side, either extreme, advocating for some like staunch policy that they really, really believe in, I always want to ask, okay, let's say you win, then what? Let's say you get what you, and I feel like that's a little bit what didn't happen with Roe. It's like, okay, you've been saying for 50 years you want Roe overturned. Then what?
Yeah.
Then what's the plan? Or, extreme left, you want to defund the police.
Right.
Okay, let's say you get that.
Yep.
Then what? What's going to happen when that happens? Or I don't think other religions should be allowed to have a display in the state capitol. Okay, let's say you get that. Then what?
Yeah.
What's going to happen then? Are you like, how are you going to determine? You don't ask the follow-up question of then what? Let's say you really believe the 2020 election was stolen and you were able to prevent the certification of the electors on January 6th. Then what? How? What about the next election? They don't think far enough down the road to go, well, what are the implications of what you are saying? Okay, you want Christian nationalism and you think that only Christians should be held to elected office? Then what? What are you going to do? Or Israel and Palestine. Okay, Israel gets all the land. Then what?
Right.
What are you going to do with all those millions of Palestinians? Or the Palestinian extremists who say from the river to the sea, okay, you get all the land. What are you going to do with 7 million Israelis? Then what? The then what should inform your policy point of view. And in this case, in Texas, they've said we've basically outlawed all abortion, and now they're being asked the then what consequence. What happens to a woman who has an unsustainable pregnancy, who could be infertile if she doesn't have that pregnancy ended? Then what? What are you going to do? You have to have common sense cutouts here in the law and empower the right people to be making those decisions. But no one wants the then what, because if you say there are reasonable exceptions here, you're going to be punished by the extremists in your own party who will only vote for people who don't think about the then what.
This is where I just wish we learned more of our politics from local politics than from social media. Because in local politics, there are significantly less incentives for you to grandstand. You just won't get it done. If you show up in your local city council and you're like, I want to defund the police, or I want all abortions to be illegal, cool, you gave a cool speech to the 20 other people who showed up to this meeting, but what did that do? You have to show up with the concessions you're willing to give. You have to write a bunch of letters. You have to sacrifice. It actually costs you something, and you're involved in relationships. Whereas if your introduction to politics, and this is where I worry for my generation and those younger than me, if your introduction to politics is social media, you have not learned an incentive structure to compromise, to seek common ground. You have learned an incentive structure that says you grandstand, you say the most ridiculous thing, you say the most extreme thing, and that gets you praise, either for being so far right or so far left. And that's why I keep drumming the drum of local politics, not because it's perfect, not because you can't be extreme there, you totally can. But I think being involved in the nitty-gritty of stuff, not only you're just forced to compromise, you don't have the same incentive structure, but also you tend to learn that some things that you hypothetically think are so clear are actually way more complicated, because you show up to the crisis pregnancy center and you meet the woman that's in a situation that you never thought of, or you show up to, some really difficult neighborhood and you watch a police officer and you go, I don't know how I respond. What's the alternative to that? I don't know. Suddenly it's so much more complicated. And I wish that was our introduction to political life, was I live in a neighborhood. There are certain demands upon me to care for the people in my neighborhood. What can I very practically do? Not, okay, get on Twitter and learn what your political identity and obligation is from a bunch of people that you have never met who will reward you for being the most extreme you can possibly be.
Right. Well, and again, this gets back to the Iowa State Capitol and the Baphomet thing. It's it's performative on every level. It's just performative. It's not actually solving things. And that doesn't work on a local level. You have to solve things. But whatever. Okay, there's one more story I want to hit before we're done. Our friend Ryan Burge, who is a HOLYPOST pundit and a sociologist at Eastern Illinois University.
Skye, really quickly,
Yeah.
the internet is very upset at you for mispronouncing pundit. So be very clear.
Pundit. Because an N sound, I know it's pundit, but I can't
Okay,
help
great.
that there's an N that just kind of slips in there sometimes because pundit.
Good job.
Pundit. It sounds a little Indian, doesn't it? Pundit. Yeah, it's easier to do it with an Indian accent, honestly.
Well, you eventually got there. So.
Pundit. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, Ryan Burge has got this interesting piece, and we'll link to it. There's a lot to it. I don't have time to kind of unpack all of it, but here's what it comes down to. So dating back to 2008, there has been a cooperative election study where self-identified evangelicals report how often they attend church. And not surprising, fewer people are attending church, even though they still identify as evangelicals. So this is Ryan writing. He says, I calculated the share of Democrats and Republicans who say that religion is very important, but also the share who attend religious services every week. And he did that for every year dating back to 2008. And here's what he concluded. For Democrats, religious importance dropped at twice the rate as religious attendance. And for Republicans, religious attendance dropped faster than religious importance. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to summarize, he says, Democrats are moving away from the idea of religion faster than they are moving away from actual religion. But for Republicans, it's the opposite. They are moving away from religious attendance faster than they are moving away from the idea of religion. Mm-hmm. So does that make sense? Like to put this in my language, fewer Democrats are saying they're religious, but they're still attending religious services. Yeah. Whereas more Republicans are saying they're very religious, but they're less likely to attend religious services. So why is this an issue? He goes on to say, I believe religion is a net positive for a functioning society, but there's a huge caveat. Religion is a net positive only when people actively engage in all the aspects of religious life, including regular corporate worship. Mm-hmm. When it comes to religion, guess who's the least tolerant? According to surveys, the least tolerant people are those who believe the Bible is literally true. But guess who's the most tolerant? Those who attend religious services at least once a week. Yep. And he concludes, what American religion has become is primarily all the harmful aspects of religion and very little of the democracy-building activities that we very desperately need. It's been reduced to a weapon that is wielded in the culture war without any training in its proper use. That's why religion has become so polarizing, because the type of religion that most Americans see now has been stripped bare of all of its best parts. And all we are left with is the division, the hate, and the vitriol. The pews are emptying because they aren't full. Okay, so what he's basically saying is religious ideas make you into a jerk, but religious community makes you into a good religious person, because you have to apply your religious ideas in the reality of community that's diverse and with people that think differently than you, maybe live a little bit differently than you, have experience differently than you. So the actual incarnate expression of religion tends to make people better, more tolerant, more kind, more engaging. But if you strip out the community aspect of it and you just make it an identity, you get all the tribal negatives of religious polarization.
Yeah, that's where that's where I would nuance ideas, because I don't think it's just, if you have good Christian doctrine but you don't go to church, that's, is this a question of symbolism and language apart from real belief and practice? And that's where I've been reading this book called The Godless Crusade by Tobias Kremer that basically is like both scientific, like social scientific study of what you just described Ryan Burge saying, of like actually a lot of right-wing efforts in the West are actually becoming less religious, like truly religious, but also more dangerous, because those symbols and ideas are really powerful. And they often have more to do, and we've talked about this a ton with Christian nationalism, they have more to do with kind of wanting some sense of rooting your identity and your community in something older, being able to draw back and say, this is, in terms of Christian nationalism, this is the story of a Christian nation, which there's different versions of that. He goes through examples in Germany and in France, very different kind of stories they tell themselves, but still how religion can often just be used as a way to kind of get some sense of rootedness or tradition, relate it to family and nation and blood and like those kinds of things. And that's where we know that's dangerous.
It can just be a way of saying God's on my side, not your side.
I can just make it existential. Like everything now is
Right.
just like this level of, I can decapitate the devil in the government building. Like now it just has that level of, but
Right.
what I think is important in that, like I think this on some level should be a comfort to people who feel like, gosh, I see all this stuff online about how, really extreme these right-wing Christians are, but like I show up to my church and people are caring for immigrants and feeding the hungry. And so on some level, I think that should be a comfort to them. But then the other part, something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and we've talked about this before, is I'm thinking of like the grandma in a church who is not read up on all of the stuff that we're reading up on, is trying to be a faithful Christian, shows up to church every Sunday, but hears people using Christian language and symbols in public and is worried that that's declining, is worried that Christianity won't be accepted, is worried maybe of extreme things like persecution, but maybe just that like she wants Christian faith to impact her public life. And the only people she sees doing that are the people who are using these kind of external trappings of Christianity and get sucked into something kind of scary and not at all Christian and doesn't kind of realize that that's where this person is going, might vote in a way that concerns me, might show up to a conference that worries me, might listen to, podcasts or read books or by people that really worry me. But it's not that she is looking for this extreme right-wing stuff. It's that she's looking for something Christian, and they have co-opted that kind of external language and symbol.
Totally. One of the reasons why this story caught my attention this week is, Christmas is a couple days away. And it's the holiday when we remember that God came to dwell among us and took on flesh.
Yeah.
He was incarnate. He shared in our human experience. And it's just a reminder to me that the best Christianity is practiced incarnately. Mm-hmm. It's practiced in community. It's practiced with other people. It reminds me a little bit like I get annoyed with people who have no children, don't care about children, don't spend any time with children, but are telling everyone else what they're doing wrong as a parent.
Yeah. I mean, I
Right?
don't like those people anyway.
Right, exactly. But like you set yourself up as a
An authority.
the expert, an
Yeah,
authority. Yes,
yeah.
and it's like really, really, and like Caitlin, you're a great example of the opposite of that. Though you are not a parent, you spend a lot of time with kids.
Yeah. And I'm not
And
going to tell
when you-
anyone how to parent.
Right. Well, and I am both a parent and I spend time with kids, and I don't tell anybody. But when I fly a lot, I'm on airplanes a lot. You do too. Invariably, there's someone there with a screaming kid.
Yep.
And my initial, no matter how tired I am, how much I just want to get home or whatever, I'm on that plane. I have a great deal of empathy
Yes.
for that
Yes.
person traveling with that kid because I have been there. I know what it's like. It's hard. And as annoying as it might be for me as a passenger, it's even harder
Yes.
for that parent or guardian, whoever has that kid. Like you just build empathy by being in community.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Burge's article seems to be saying here are there are more and more people, at least on the conservative end of the spectrum, who are claiming religious identity, but are not claiming religious community. And that's kind of frightening
Yeah.
because it means they're drawing all the authority that you can from religion without any of the sacrifice that goes into practicing that in an actual lived experience with other people. And on the flip side, he doesn't do as much on the Democratic side because religious belief is less prevalent there. But it shows that even Democrats who maybe don't consider themselves highly religious are still engaging in religious practices and community. So it raises bigger questions
Yeah.
of how do belief and practice go together?
Yeah.
And which is really more formative. And obviously the best is for both of them to go together and
Yeah.
reinforce each other. But I don't know, it's kind of a scary thing he ends on here with, we're getting all the worst from religion now, with where it's just the polarization and tribal identity without all the tempering that comes from religious
Yeah.
community and actually sharing life together, which is pretty critical.
Yeah. I mean, and this is why I say this grandma who I'm worried about, or this young person, or this family, or whatever, that starts down this road because of the kind of external trappings of Christianity, just the language, the symbols, without any of the content. Part of the benefit then of their community requires that we're having conversations about this stuff. So a church that is, yes, moderating that person's impulses just because they're meeting people who are different from them and they're kind of seeing that other people's lives are different. But some of that benefit can be lost when we're so afraid of talking about anything that could be deemed political that we never have opportunities for people in churches to have a conversation where someone can say to the person in the pew next to them, like, oh, that book you're reading, like, actually, maybe there's some other alternatives you could read, or maybe there's a different way that you could. And also on the kind of more evangelistic end of, I have great respect for multiple pastors that I know who feel like the kind of really far-right Christian nationalist world should be treated more like a mission field. And for them, it's, okay, look, you say you're interested in these Christian ideas and symbols, and what if you came to our church? What if we try to do the really slow work of actually introducing you to the God who did come in a vulnerable baby on Christmas? Like, what if that was our response for those people vocationally to say, look, like, this is an inroad, actually. You're really interested in some of the external trappings of this. Like, what if I tried really hard to show you the real content here, the real truth here? Maybe it actually is pretty captivating. Maybe it is really beautiful. Maybe the Holy Spirit really will work in you in this very unexpected way. I mean, I have friends who have seen people come to faith at right-wing conferences and eventually over time discover the real Jesus, who might not have been the version that was first presented to them.
Well, I don't think most of us, when we come to faith, start with a full picture of the real Jesus. It's a whole process of getting more and more clarity on that. Okay, Caitlin, thank you for helping me keep this show going while Phil is convalescing. Phil, we do hope you get better soon and can join us, because we have a lot more work to do before the end of the year, and we need you upright and peppy. Give us your thoughts, everyone, on what you think's going on with that abortion ruling in Texas, and just your thoughts on where we are in this crazy landscape post-Roe. And, of course, the Iowa Baphomet thing, religious diversity, whatever. And I hope everyone has a great Christmas. We have some bonus material. Caitlin and I recorded a Getting Schooled with Caitlin Chess about St. Nicholas.
Yes! Some wacky stuff. So for those who want
very, very weird stuff that I did not know about, involving pickles and children and
classic.
Weird. Very weird. Yep. Very weird. And stay tuned for a great interview, which is also about how we got the modern form of Christmas. So hopefully people can enjoy all this interesting historic trivia that will enrich your faith and make for great table conversations with relatives with whom you are trying to avoid more divisive topics. Okay. Thanks for being with us, guys. Till next time. See ya.
Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones? I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf-stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode. Today's episode of the Holy Post is sponsored by Magic Spoon. What's that? Let me explain. I got a box in the mail from a new company that wanted to sponsor the podcast. I opened it up and it was full of breakfast cereal. I like breakfast cereal, but the box said this cereal had 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs. It's high protein, no sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free. And I thought, oh no, this is going to taste like packing peanuts. So I poured myself a small bowl of the peanut butter flavor and gave it a try. And the next thing I said was, Lisa, you got to come try this. And she said, wow, that's really good. But then our 6-year-old granddaughter, Marley, came over, so we had her test it. She tried all 4 flavors that come in the variety pack: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. And then she wanted to eat more. She liked them so much, she asked if she could take the whole box back to her house. Seriously, Magic Spoon cereal, only 140 calories a serving, and it tastes really good. You got to check this out. So go to magicspoon.com/holypost HOLYPOST to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use our promo code HOLYPOST at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, get your next delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/HOLYPOST and use the code HOLYPOST to save $5 off. And thank you to Magic Spoon for surprising me and for sponsoring this episode.
My guest today is David Taylor. He's the Associate Professor of Theology and Culture at Fuller Theological Seminary and the author of several books, including his most recent books, Prayer for the Pilgrimage and A Body of Praise. He's also written a number of articles for the Washington Post, Image Journal, Religion News Service, Theology Today, and Christianity Today. Taylor is an Anglican priest, and he's lectured widely on the role of the arts. In 2016, he also produced a short film on the Psalms with Bono and Eugene Peterson. He's joining me to talk about an article he wrote about the origins of Christmas in America. It's normal to assume that Christians have always celebrated Christmas, and that it was only recently that the holiday became secularized. That assumption is what's behind the so-called War on Christmas crusades and Christians demanding that we put Christ back into Christmas. But Taylor says it's a lot more complicated than that. In fact, it's Christians and the church who may be the most responsible for the secularization of Christmas. I think you'll find this conversation really illuminating as we discuss who and what has shaped our Christmas cultural practices. Here is David Taylor. David Taylor, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks for having me, Skye. Good to be here.
Well, for people who are watching the video, they can see your empty shelves and boxes behind you. And I caught you at a moment when you guys are moving, which is just crazy. So thank you for your time. Not an easy thing to pull off. A couple of years ago, you wrote an article titled "Why Putting Christ Back in Christmas is Not Enough." And it goes into the history of the holiday season, Christmas in America. Let's start with this. You distinguish between what you call Christmas in America and the Feast of the Nativity.
Mm-hmm.
Define those two relatively briefly? What's the difference?
Let me define it after sort of just providing a quick context.
Sure.
I know that when I originally wrote this, some people were worried that I was going to be a Debbie Downer on Christmas in our country. And so just for what it's worth, I actually have no interest in being, Scrooge-like with this. But what originated sort of this article was actually something I had been wondering for actually maybe a couple of decades. And that was Christmas after Christmas after Christmas. I noticed that we kept singing essentially like 25 Christmas hymns or carols. And it struck me as very strange that around a celebration of the incarnation of, the nativity of the second person of the Trinity, we would have such a small roster of songs in relation, say, to Easter, where we proliferate. Every year new songs are created to
Great point.
To the cross and resurrection. And then I did get a little bit curmudgeonly about it because I thought surely there are other stories, other themes, that could be explored by musicians. Why is it that there's this, lockdown, kind of like this visceral antipathy towards the introduction of new, songs, hymns, choruses? And then what I did was, this would have been maybe 7 years ago, I partnered with a colleague friend of mine from Duke Divinity and from Calvin Institute of Christian Worship to run a series of retreats for songwriters to invite them to write new Christmas songs or hymns that would give voice, to the more rich landscape of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So we did that for 3 years, and it was fantastic. And over the course of that time, I thought to myself, that there might be benefit to putting into essay form some of the things that we were exploring. That is, I think, the background for this. And the basic case that I make in the essay is that while Christmas is in America is something that I think in good conscience, we can enjoy and celebrate and delight in. I think it's important for us as Christians, at least in this country, to understand that it is a very recent phenomenon, like the
Hmm.
shape of it, and that it bears relatively little resemblance to the stories of Matthew and Luke. So, in our interest to be biblically faithful, to be biblically rigorous, to be attentive to the Word of God and the Word made flesh, I think we're missing out on the fullness and the richness and really the power of these two stories that Christmas, as we celebrate it in our country, fails to tell or to invite us into.
Great. So, many people who listen to this show for a long time know that I studied history as an undergraduate
Oh, well
and
done.
love reading history. I got Abraham Lincoln right
Yeah.
here from a recent, but and part of my ongoing struggle is so few Americans grasp history on any
Mm-hmm.
level, let
Mm-hmm.
alone even the church history and theological and religious history. So all of that kind of comes to bear on this question of Christmas because it is
Mm-hmm.
theological and biblical and historical, but it's also very contemporary, and we don't even realize that the popular ways in which we celebrate this holiday don't go back very far. We
Mm-hmm.
assume that they go back 2,000 years. They don't at all. And that's what your article does a great job unpacking. So the Christmas in America narrative, which is your way of talking about the way we popularly engage this holiday, you argue has four influences from recent history. So I want to kind of unpack those four influences. And let's begin with the Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
Explain their posture towards Christmas. And when I say Puritans, I mean early English settlers in New
Yeah.
England,
Right.
17th to 18th century. What was their understanding of Christmas, and how has that impacted the way we currently think about it?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful to slightly qualify the word Puritan because maybe some people think they hear the word Puritan and they think very narrow, stodgy, hyper strict, uh, rulers ready to slap, the hands of those who transgress, this or that. But really, we should think of them as our primary forebears. For many of
Hmm.
us, as if we're willing to call ourselves still evangelicals in this country, they would be our forebears. In the 17th century, the celebrations around the end of the calendar year in December were rather wanton affairs. There was, drinking that led to excessive inebriation. There was a lot of sex going on, some riotings, aggressive behavior. It's what I call a frat party gone terribly wrong. And so, the Puritans, the Christians of the time in England, felt that this was not conducive to a good society, good health, and so they outlawed it. And then I think the other reason that motivated them to outlaw these celebrations, these Yuletide celebrations, is that Christmas, as it was known in the European, continent, it was rather Catholic. It smelled of papish type, practices, and they looked in the New Testament and they did not see any evidence that the celebration of the Mass of Christ, the birth of Christ, was commanded, and they wanted to be biblically faithful. So they said, well, this is not part of our faithful practice as followers of Jesus, so we will not do it. The U.S. Congress met regularly on Christmas Day from 1789 to 1855. That's 66 years of meeting on Christmas, and right now I know Congress people are trying to get things passed before they go to for their holidays.
Right.
It's now celebrated. And it wasn't until 1836 that the blessed state of Alabama was the first to legalize, to permit the public celebration of Christmas.
So you cite from another source a prohibition against the celebration of Christmas from the Puritans, and this is what it said: the observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanic practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. And they're calling what looks like the way we all practice Christmas satanic.
Yeah, some strong language.
Yeah, I mean, so it wasn't just, hey, this is getting out of hand and this is getting a little bit too rowdy and it's not becoming of proper Christian behavior. It's flat out satanic. And it's just ironic because there's so many quarters of our culture today that would say a failure to acknowledge
Mm,
Christmas
mm,
explicitly
mhm,
is now seen as satanic or
mm,
somehow, in league with the enemy.
right.
Um, so, okay, so you have the Puritan era,
Uh-huh.
which was very much, this is not a sacred day. We're not going to practice it. And those who do are either Catholic or satanic or both. Um, then you talk about the Victorian era,
Mhm.
which, for those unfamiliar with history, the time period in which Queen Victoria ruled the British Empire.
Right,
What did that era and Queen Victoria herself bring
right.
to our understanding of Christmas?
So Alabama makes Christmas legal to celebrate in 1836. In 1837, Princess Victoria becomes Queen of England, is married to Prince Albert, who is German. And now the Germans, as Lutherans in many ways, have retained many of Christmas uh, traditions or practices that would have been common across the European continent, that would have been common, I think, in sort of a liturgical kind of setting, that Martin Luther was willing to adopt or adapt, or retain some of the, traditional Catholic Mass that he would have, grown up with. And alongside of that, a more sort of ample space for extra liturgical type celebrations, Christmas being one of them. I mean, Christmas is and was a official liturgical celebration in the Catholic world. And so, that German Lutheran background that Prince Albert brings, then and Queen Victoria has, German family as well. And so they themselves, in their own persons, feel permission and conviction that there is something good in the enjoyment and the putting up of a tree and the celebrating, the decorating of a tree and some of the singing and so on and so forth. So they are officially the ones who introduce the practice of the Christmas tree, the bringing, cutting down a Christmas tree and setting it up and decorating it and putting presents around it. But what happened is, because the Church of England and other churches in England are not active participants, they're not partners in this retrieval or recovery of Christmas, or repurposing of Christmas for that matter. What happens in effect is that Christmas is relocated from an ecclesial and a liturgical context, which would have been the central context from which everything would, radiate out, to a domestic and private affair. And that's what allows really a trajectory to kind of take off that would make Christmas private, domestic, and secular. Secular in the sense, not like a negative secular, but just not ecclesial or
Right,
church.
not central to the church.
Yes. And so I think those are some dynamics that are rather powerful. You have somebody in a position of power within, the English world, and then they establish tradition of a Christmas card, and so they have a painting photograph of themselves, and those get sent out. And in that dissemination of that image, Christians around the world, including in this country, think to themselves, well, I would like to have something like that. Look how lovely it is and how delightful and wonder filled that is. And an image proved to be more powerful than many words to the contrary.
Okay, so it sounds like there's two levels here to the Victorian influence. One is just the symbols that we associate with the celebration of Christmas, the tree, the
Mhm,
giving of cards,
mhm,
and the centrality of the family,
mhm. The
mother, father,
domestic family.
kids,
Yeah,
the domestic family. All of that really is driven by the celebrity of Queen Victoria, who's the most famous person in the English speaking world.
absolutely.
So that's one level. It's just like, okay, thank you. You gave us those things that we all recognize as what we do at the holiday
Mhm,
season. On a deeper level, though, is the dynamic that was a vacuum that the church did not fill
mhm,
because of the influence of the Puritans and other conservative Christian
mhm,
influencers. The church abdicated its celebration of Christmas. And so it created a vacuum that was then filled by Victoria
Right.
in the domestic sphere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's sort of the opposite narrative that we tend to believe today. The narrative we tend to believe is Christmas is first and foremost a Christian celebration of the incarnation of Jesus, and it has always been centered on the church, and
Mm-hmm.
somehow it got stolen from us
Mm.
and secularized
Yeah.
and prostituted for profit by, by the consumeristic culture.
Right.
And the church is angry because Christmas has been stolen from us, when in reality, it sounds like you're saying the church abdicated Christmas, gave it up, gave it to the culture. And the culture said, thank you very much. We'll be happy to take it off your hands.
Right. Right. I mean, maybe another way to capture what took place, in the mid-19th century, onwards, is if you were to ask let's just say your average Christian in this country, which is, we'll put it in a very mild way, which is preferable, to celebrate Christmas Day with your family at home, or to celebrate the 25th of Christmas with the body of Christ in the sanctuary, wherever it is that you gather. I would venture to say that vast majority would say not just that it ought to be celebrated at home with your family, but it is the more faithful
Right.
and true, and to ask a domestic nuclear family to go to church on Christmas Day would feel like some kind of violation of the 11th commandment, the 12th commandment, one of the extra
Oh, I
commandments.
know.
And
Yeah.
and that is not the case for many Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or certain Anglicans,
Right.
or certain Lutherans, where Christmas Day is an ecclesial liturgical event as a way to name that the family of God, this cross-generational, cross-cultural, family of Jesus Christ, is more central. It is really what defines us, not the nuclear domestic. And so that would just be like a little,
Mhm.
weather vane to say, what is it do you think really matters? And I think most people would say the domestic. And then I think that's just a little sign of like, maybe we haven't read the Gospels closely enough.
It's a great point. And it really gets pushed every so many years when Christmas Day falls on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And I was a pastor many years ago, and I remember when the calendar would show up and it was Christmas is on Sunday, and the debate was always, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
Do we? And it was like, and then I worked at Christianity Today, and I remember again Christmas falling on a Sunday, and I did a series of articles looking at what are churches doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the most dominant themes that came up was mega churches almost across the country closed on Christmas Day,
Mm-hmm.
even though it was a Sunday. And when you dug in and I interviewed leaders about why are you closing, what it came down to was it takes a ton of volunteers to open up a megachurch on any given Sunday, from parking attendants to childcare workers.
Right.
And one pastor even was honest enough to say, it costs us X amount of money to heat the building on a Sunday morning, and we're not going to get enough offerings on Christmas Sunday
Yeah.
to even open the building
Right.
to turn on the heat, because people prefer to be home with their families. Yeah, it's a great way to look at it. We just assume this is a family-centric day, not an ecclesiastical focus day, unlike other traditions. Okay, third.
Okay.
So we've talked about the Puritans, we've talked about Queen Victoria, Charles Dickens, and everyone knows A Christmas Carol. We don't appreciate how impactful that story has been in our celebration of this holiday. Explain that impact.
Obviously, Charles Dickens can only be understood within his own historical context, and we don't have time to go into it. I think positively what A Christmas Carol did was it inspired in the English people and beyond a desire, a more compelling desire or reason for loving one's neighbor who was worse off. There was, such a fracture across socioeconomic classes. You did have this massive population of poor and orphaned, and he does such a service to a society to help them reimagine what it means to be a neighbor. I think maybe more unfortunately for Christians at some level is he tells a tale of Christmas in a way that leaves out maybe some of the sharper edges of the gospel nativity narrative, or the scandalous, elements of the incarnation, which, they are scandalous. And so you have this sense that it's the spirit of Christmas that is central, rather than the spirit of Jesus Christ, who hovers over the Virgin Mary, and who, hovers over the, the disciples at Pentecost, and enables something truly revolutionary to occur in human history. And so civil religion is allowed to flourish in place of, or over against, this sort of radical news of the incarnation of God. And so, for example, working on Christmas Day during Dickens' time was normal. It was a normal, assumed thing. You would work, and
Even Congress did it.
yeah. But his story eventually had this effect of shaming it out of practice, shaming it into
That's
becoming
fascinating. Yeah.
an illegal thing, because what you ought to be doing is to be at home with your family, and again, at at the core of that story, there's so many things that are true. But again, we're sort of creating this conglomeration of genetic, material that is turning into this inertia of a story, and that story will rule the world, at least the Western world, from there on out. So, again, the Christmas Carol allows a British people, to feel kindly regard towards their neighbor, which they ought to, we would say, as followers of
Hmm.
Jesus, but without any sense of, the costly radical neighbor love that Jesus would invite us to. And again, you have a story that in itself is not problematic, but it arises outside of ecclesial, Christian kind of circles. And again, there's nothing wrong. Truth can come from anywhere, but again, it's
Yeah.
consistently a failure of the church to take responsibility, and a holy, joyful responsibility to tell the story of the nativities of Matthew and Luke. So that's, I think, in short, what happens. And this is
Yeah.
6 years after Princess Victoria becomes queen, right? So a lot of things are happening in a very short amount of time that are setting a trajectory for Anglo-American history.
I forget who it was. Somebody talked about how so much of Western liberal democracy is an attempt to have the kingdom of God without the king.
Yeah.
Right, because you want equal rights for all people, you want human dignity, you want opportunity, you want, all these good things, but you don't want Jesus. You don't want that
Exactly.
to be the unifying factor. It sounds like that's a little bit what's going on here with A Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
We want love for your neighbor. We want generosity and
Right.
kindness. We want,
Right.
strong family bonds and harmony across classes and diversity in our societies. But it's all in the name of the Christmas spirit, or the spirit of Christmas,
Right.
rather than Christ. And
Right.
you see that to this day in almost every popular Christmas song
Oh, yeah.
or popular Christmas movie. Those are the themes,
Mhm.
but they're not grounded in the gospel. They're not grounded in any explicit Christian iconography of
Mhm.
this holiday. It's all just the
Right.
Christmas spirit. Um, okay, and probably we don't have to spend a ton of time on this because we're going to cover it elsewhere. But the symbol of all of that ends up becoming
Mhm.
Santa Claus.
Mhm.
Uh, Most people are familiar, or at least have some knowledge, that the myth of Santa Claus, finds its origins in the story of Saint Nicholas,
Mhm. Mhm.
a bishop from what is today modern day Turkey.
Mhm.
But you talk about how this idea of Santa Claus really takes off in parallel to the massive consumerism that
Mhm.
engages our culture in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Right. Right.
Talk about that symbiotic relationship between consumer
Yeah.
capitalism and Santa Claus.
It's a far more involved and complicated story than, obviously we can give
Right.
it credit, and attention here. But let's just say in 1810, you have uh, Dutch emigres in New York City wanting to inspire, the leadership level, a more noble, honorable, kindly, virtuous city life, community life. And so a woodcut artist is enlisted to create an image of Saint Nicholas, Sinterklaas, as the Dutch might call it. And this is 1810, and Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas, still has a bishop's robe. As the 1800s go on, Sinterklaas becomes Santa Claus, and he is losing his ecclesiastical vestments, and they're being replaced with, again, I want to say, there's a loveliness and a delight and a joy and a playfulness to how St. Nicholas acquires, a sleigh and a new home in the North Pole, and assistance in the form of reindeer. And you have all these artists and poets who are recasting St. Nicholas, Bishop of Myra, of the early 14th century, into this figure of good cheer. And it culminates, if you will, in 1931. The Coca-Cola company is trying to figure out how to, get its product more attractive to children, young people, who would be central to helping it to succeed, as it always has been the case with advertising. And so they commissioned Haddon Sundblom to create a wholesome image of Santa Claus that would be able to connect emotionally with children. And to say, oh, I want to have a personal encounter with Santa Claus. So not something that's a fun story out there, but a Santa Claus who will come and connect in my heart and my home, and of course buy lots of Coca-Cola. And he, for decades, he just, every year he cranked out these images of Santa Claus. And of course, who we have today, the ho ho ho, is this slow, evolution of an image that originates in a saint of the church, a bishop who cared deeply about the poor. And so artists help us to reimagine the world otherwise. And it's so difficult to get outside of that imaginative horizon. It's just like, if you stand in West Texas, you look around, you can see every point of the horizon. You can't see beyond it. And that's what Santa Claus is today. It's just so impossible at some level to imagine anything but, Coca-Cola's blessed Sinterklaas.
Yeah, it makes me think that instead of milk and cookies, we should really be leaving out some, I don't know, potato chips and Coca-Cola for Santa on Christmas Eve. Reading your article, it was, I mean, I know there are other sources that go into greater depth here, but it's hard to overstate how influential the Coca-Cola company has been
Mm.
in
Mhm.
shaping our
Mm.
popular culture's
Yeah.
imagery and understanding of the Santa Claus myth.
Right.
And we're going to do something for our Patreon supporters special just on that topic more. All right, let's having unpacked kind of those 4 core influences on Christmas in America. I'm curious to talk to you about what you make of the rhetoric we've heard in recent years coming from some sectors of conservative Christianity that there is a quote unquote war on Christmas
Right.
in our culture. And I've even heard politicians say, thank God for Donald Trump because now we can say Merry Christmas again. I don't recall anybody ever telling me I can't say Merry Christmas, but you seem a little bit hesitant to get on board with the let's put Christ back into Christmas bandwagon.
Right.
Why?
Well, I mean, I think at some level we're dealing with a missiological question. What does it mean to be on mission in a country that is, ethnically, religiously, politically pluralistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does it look like for us to offer neighbor love? And I think that's obviously at play at a very core level. Christian nationalism and other sort of ideas about, are we a Christian nation, and what does that mean? What does that look like? These come into play, and they're these larger sort of gravitational tectonic forces that may remain invisible to many of us, but they certainly are at play. But with respect to more the surface level of this question of a war on Christmas, I would say maybe we're fighting the wrong war. That what we are attempting to preserve, Christmas in America, as I described in the article, perhaps ought not to be preserved because It is at best a poor and deficient reflection of the stories of Matthew and Luke. At worst, it is a defective, malformative um, uh, representation of those stories. And if we were able to sink ourselves deeply into these narratives, I think we might find ourselves less anxious, perhaps, about whether we can say Merry Christmas at Walmart or Target or otherwise, and more deeply convicted and convinced that the good news of the incarnation is, as it were, gooder, more radical, more scary and terrifying and fantastical and destabilizing than we may often allow or imagine. And again, maybe to go back to my sort of original uh, um, metaphor of sort of inertias and gravitational and genetic forces. If we want to just slip, the Jesus back into the reason for the season or Christ back into Xmas, I think it's just going to get gobbled up, drowned out and drowned down by these invisible inertias that are pulling us away from, the expansive, radical grace and mercy and love, goodness that we witness in the incarnation. And so, again, like in one sense, I don't really have a dog in the fight, as it were. I don't get sort of, rustled up or fussed up about it. I understand why people do. I just think you're getting upset about the wrong thing. Um, so I guess the essay is ultimately an invitation to the reader to read the gospel afresh.
Yeah, and you wrap up the essay with a brief exploration of some of the themes we do find in Matthew and Luke's stories that are really incongruent with the Christmas in America stories. You talk about that these are stories of hardship and loss and pain. They're multi-generational, multicultural stories. They're fantastical stories of angelic visitors and even justice stories. The songs that Mary especially sings, talking about turning the world upside down.
Yeah.
These are not themes that dominate popular Christmas culture in America. So what I took away from your article was, well, two things. One, let's really immerse ourselves in the biblical narratives and allow that to shape us rather than the cultural narrative around Christmas. But secondly, and this was not overt in your article, but one of my takeaways is there's a price to pay when the church abandons something that is rightfully its own. That vacuum ends up getting filled. I'm thinking about, for example, so much of popular evangelicalism over, depending on your time frame, has abandoned a social and corporate dimension to its gospel. And because we haven't talked about that and we only talk about the personal, that vacuum's been filled by the culture, and it's filled with Christian nationalism, or it's filled by other pseudo gospels that come in and teach people how to think about their corporate life. So anyway, your article was a reminder to me just on the Christmas front, like the church needs to speak into all the facets of our lives. And if we don't speak into those things, popular culture will fill it with unchristian values and alternatives. So to that end, final question, how are you planning on celebrating the Feast of the Nativity?
Well, we just we moved houses 3 days ago, and so we're in feels like a very unstable, derailed place, and we only just put up our Christmas tree yesterday, and it's actually been hard because the kids have been pretty bummed out. That our previous home was just full of boxes. There's no Christmas tree. There's just one little Advent, space on top of the piano. And as parents, I mean, we want to care for our children. We want to provide, a special experience of joy and to retain traditions that we do, cherish. But at the same time, my wife Ada and I are thinking perhaps this can become an opportunity not to teach our children a lesson, not that, invite them into the hard edges of the stories of Matthew and Luke that have these stories of infidelity and being a refugee and the massacre of the innocents and all this loss and sorrow. And maybe this is a way for us as a family to enter more meaningfully, more intimately into that aspect of the story. Not that we won't have hot chocolate, not that we won't have stockings, but perhaps this is an occasion, right, for us to say, it's not what we had wished or planned for Christmas 2023, but perhaps it's an invitation for us, and we will worship, with our Anglican church, on the different celebrations. And we did St. Nicholas Day on December 6th, and we'll celebrate, the various feast days in the 12 days of Christmas, culminating in the Feast of the Epiphany, as a way to help our children really see, like, wow, it's a crazy series of stories that mark this. And no matter what you experience in your years to come, there are beautiful, blessed saints in Scripture and church history who have probably gone through something similar. So you're not alone in this experience. And so, I mean, I know it sounds rather idealistic of me to say this. In actual practice, our children, we just want more chocolate. So it's like, okay,
right.
that's fair.
Well,
fair enough.
I mean, I suppose if you get to a certain age, I can look back on a handful of Christmases that were not what I expected them to be because of unforeseen things. But what you're describing is one of the dominant themes of the biblical narrative, which is dislocation.
Right, exactly.
From Jesus giving up the treasures of union with Father to inhabit flesh, to the dislocation of Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, the dislocation of it goes on and on and on. The refugee story, all of it. So I hope you have a blessed Christmas time with your kids. But I really do hope that they look back on this year as a time where they did get an experiential glimpse into that theme of dislocation, which affects us throughout our lives. But David, thank you for your scholarship on this and helping us understand the context in which we are in and celebrating. It's been super helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Skye.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.